Welcome, everyone. Another episode, season 4, Runners Roundtable, where this season is dedicated to female runners who are inspiring us to make the running community better and who are making the running community better themselves. And today I'm joined by Carolyn Su, and I'm really delighted to be able to talk to you because I just discovered you discovered you. That's like such a weird way to say it, but I just discovered you on Instagram back in October. And it was when, and we don't have to go into it at all, but it was when everything with Tracksmith was going on. And I went down the rabbit hole of Tracksmith, and I was like, I call it like it was a popcorn moment for me where I was just on my phone. Like, I'm like, oh, let me follow the different people who are commenting here or people who are being tagged here. And that's how I came across your account, because someone else had tagged you. And I'm like, wait a minute, what's going on here? And then you had published a post that addressed it. And it's not about the singlet post, which I think was incredible because people were kind of missing the point on it. But that's how I found you. And then I continued down the rabbit hole of everything else that you do. And I knew that I had to speak to you because storytelling is something that is incredibly important to me. And it's through stories that we adults learn and grow, right? When we're younger, we go to school and we learn math and we learn how to read and we learn how to write. But once we become adults and we've learned the math and the reading and the writing, we still have to continue growing and evolving. And I find that happens through stories and through learning and hearing other people's stories. So once I landed on the Diverse We Run page, I'm like, wait a minute, storytelling, it's right there. It's right. Like, I totally have to speak to Carolyn and amplify your voice and amplify your story in the way that I can. So before I say anything else or anything else happens, can you introduce yourself to us and tell us how you got into running?
Yes. Hello. Thank you for having me here, Steph. Yeah, that it's always really interesting to hear about how people come across the Diverse We Run page or come across my own personal Instagram account. And it's also always really scary when people when anyone tags you on Instagram for any reason, you're kind of like, what is this about? Why? But yeah, I guess just kind of background and context. I'm Carolyn Su. I am Chinese American, and I was born and raised in Houston, Texas. And I am now here based out of Boston, Massachusetts. I am a mom. I am a runner, trail runner, marathoner, writer, advocate. I do a lot of I do a lot of work and writing, through writing, I should say, more specifically in the running world. Like you had mentioned, I storytell on the Instagram platform I created a few years ago called Diverse We Run. And that is a place where I share stories of people of color, just talking about how our cultural background, our race, shapes our entry into the sport and how that continues to shape how we experience the sport and the community. So yeah, that's in short version who I am and what I do. So
When
thank you
did,
for having me.
yeah, when did you start running?
Oh, I started running 2001, which was my freshman year in college. And I guess that kind of dates dates it now.
You're like
Oh
that.
man, now that sounds so far long ago, but yeah. So,
It's, it's a version of you that's been with you for a really, really long time. And I often think of I started running later than you, but it was 2012. And when I think about it, I'm like, wow, that is a committed relationship. Like
Yeah,
I never
yeah.
considered myself a runner before that. And here I am 11 years later, and I'm like, oh, I'm still doing this. Like this has to be love. Like this is true love
Oh,
at this point
mhm,
that I'm still
mhm.
doing that. So you start running in 2001, but I know you did not start being an advocate, right? So what happened along, I guess what happened between 2001 and I think I saw that 2019 is when you started the Diverse We Run. So what
Yeah.
happened in that time that you're like, huh, there's a gap here and let me
Yeah.
kind of fill that gap.
Yeah, okay. Like, so what happened in the last 2 decades? Oh, I mean, I think for anyone who has been a runner for even like more than a day, you know how running can be such a medium to teach teach us about ourselves and about life, right? And if you allow it to, running really shapes who we are in as we go through all the different seasons and eras of our identity, right? Growing as a person. And so I think that that's basically what happened for me. I started running, like I said, freshman year in college. And honestly, it was because I was trying to maintain an eating disorder that I had since I was 13. Um, and running was at that time, you know, it was touted by all of the different health and fitness magazines as being the most effective, efficient way of, you know, burning fat, burning calories, getting lean, all of those, you know, all of those key catchphrases. And, you know, my family had a gym membership starting from when I was 14 years old. And so I had been going to the gym ever since I was 14. So I was very familiar with, you know, elliptical trainer, group fitness classes, all of that. But for running, it just wasn't something that I was very familiar with. Um, a lot of that has to do with the fact that, you know, my parents are Chinese, Taiwanese immigrants, and they were busy establishing a semblance of life, you know, for me and my sister and relatives. You know, we all lived, we all lived together. And, um, and so there really wasn't any bandwidth for sports. And sports was definitely considered this like extracurricular luxury that quote unquote, you know, Western Americans liked to do for just enjoyment, you know, nothing more. And so, you know, I mean, I'm honestly like looking back, I'm pretty impressed and proud of my parents for at least even signing us up for a gym membership, because they understood, okay, you know, like physical health is a part of taking care of yourself, you know, and so we had that. But like I said, otherwise, again, like organized sports, not really on my radar. I was not familiar with it. I only started running because, like I said, like there were magazines that gave me instructions on how to do so, you know? And of course, you know, 2001, the internet, social media was not in existence. There were not like TikToks or YouTube videos or anything like that on like how to get into running, couch to 5K type of things, right? Like it was all like basically, if you were able to obtain a printed publication,
Yeah.
then then you would know about it. Otherwise, of course, like unless you were already involved in team sports growing up, which we already established I wasn't. So anyway, long story short, I started running because I was like, okay, well, let's try this thing. You know, I had at that point already exhausted um, a lot of my time and energy with like the stuff at the gym, and I wanted to try something different. And so, you know, freshman year, first semester, I found one friend who was willing to try this like new and outlandish thing, you know, with me. And so we went for a run, you know, from the University of Texas at Austin, like our campus, all the way to the state capitol and back. And that was about 3 miles. And I don't have any other recollection of, how that felt. Did I enjoy it, or was it difficult, or anything like that? I was purely just so focused and caught up in the numbers, of
Mhm.
calories in, calories out, all of that, that I just simply saw it as like a check mark to controlling, what I needed to control and maintain. And that kind of continued on. And that was my relationship with running, until I don't even remember which year it was, maybe 2 or 3 years later into college, where I was home visiting my parents for the summer, and I was out for a run. And in the distance, I saw an auntie in our community, an older Chinese American woman. She was out running, and my mind was blown. Like, wait a minute. Like, all my life so far, I had been told by all the aunties, older women in my life, that running was bad for me, that running was harmful, for my health, for my knees. Why am I doing stuff like that? Right. Like, and, and here is a woman who's out running. So I go up to her, I run up to her, and I was like, Auntie Estella, what are you doing? and, and it turned out, she had been running for years. And not only that, she had been running what was called a marathon. And she had run the Houston Marathon for, at that point, like 10, 11 years in a row. And she did that because she was a nurse at Memorial Hermann Hospital, and they have a charity team that runs for the Houston Marathon every single year. And that was paradigm shifting for me, because here was this woman who was from my community, who looked like me, and who was doing something utterly just like I had just never heard of before. And what was this distance called the marathon? 26.2 miles. And she had run it multiple times. What? And so that fall, when I went back to college, I looked up if there were any marathons in the Austin area. Yes, there was. There's Austin Marathon every February. And I registered myself for my first marathon. That was 2004. And yeah, that was how I became a marathoner at that
Yeah, I
point.
wanna I wanna give a shout out to Auntie Estella because it it's like a marathon is such a big deal. And I know now with social media, it seems like such an exaggeration because I love those memes of you don't have to tell people you're running a marathon. Everyone already knows because you can't stop talking about it. So it's like so it's so interesting to hear that here's this person that you didn't even know was doing it. And she had been doing it for 10, 11 years, right? Like that's a
Yeah.
big part of her life that was
Yeah.
given to the marathon distance. And you just didn't know about it. But I think it's also really interesting that, and you brought something up, and I wanted to ask you about it, right? Well, first of all, let me go back and say, now I understand I think it's one of the posts that's pinned to your Instagram account where you're like, I'm a mother, I'm a marathoner, I'm 150 pounds. And I was like, that's such an interesting thing to kind of include there. And now hearing your story, I'm like, oh, that's why it's there because it is, and I'm going to assume this and you can check me, right? Like it is a part of your story of ownership of your experience of here I am at this weight. This is the space. This is the physical space that I am taking up in this body, in this vessel, this in this lifetime. And it's okay. And it's okay to be that. And again, I saw that and I was like, oh, that's such an interesting thing. But again, hearing you speak, I'm like, oh, that's not just a statement, that's a declaration, right? Like this is
Mhm.
I'm putting this stake in the ground and we're owning it. So you're telling me, and I don't know, but guess I have like 10 questions that I want to ask you right now. And I'm trying to figure out like where's the hierarchy of questions here. But you said from 2001 to like 2004, that's where it shifted for you. And I'm curious, since 2004, how has that continued to shift for you? Because again, I'm going to assume that in 2004, you weren't like, this is my weight, yay. I'm sure there was still kind of a process, and your kids are similar in age to mine, which means you went through pregnancy, you went through your body changing, you went through,
Mhm.
at least for me, I had my babies, and afterwards I had to learn how to love my body again because
Mhm.
my body was so foreign for me. So,
Yes.
what was that journey like between here you have this marathon, and then here you have this post where you're declaring this is my weight?
Mm. Mm. Yeah. Thank you, first of all, for even identifying that it wasn't so much of a statement of my weight as much as it was a declaration, like you were saying, right? Like a reclamation
Mm,
of what a former mindset or way of thinking was. Um, yeah, it definitely was a process and a journey of learning to, first of all, before we can get to loving ourselves, right? Loving our bodies, we need to uncover and get to the root of what was causing us this disassociation, right? Or what was making us feel a sense of, I don't know, shame or a form of like rejection of who we are, the bodies that we're in, right? There are a lot of factors that play into the ways that we view ourselves to begin with, and if we don't address those things, then all of the actions we take are really ultimately, I think, just temporary and superficial. So for me, definitely in college, it got to a point where I could recognize for myself that I couldn't continue on with life the way that I was. Um, not just behaviorally speaking, but also my mindset. Um, because it got to the point where I couldn't leave my dorm room without comparing myself and measuring myself, to every single female that I would pass in the hallway, on the quad, in the campus, um, and every social gathering, all the time spent around food, which is very social. All I could think about was numbers. It was all about calculations, and there was this fear of rejection underneath it all that was tied to that. And as I've, become a mother, as I've grown into adulthood, I've been able to parse out a little bit more about like how those feelings became so tied together. And I know a large part of it for me is, being an Asian American female, growing up in a majority white centered culture. And while my parents and the immigrant community around me definitely instilled a very strong sense of, cultural pride, and at the same time, I felt like I existed and operated in what I considered the real world, the real life, of not of looking a certain way that was deemed as less than. And I think that played a lot into my sense of worth and place in life. And there was a strong fear of being found out as other, which is silly in a way, like, when we think about it, because it's like I can't change, obviously, like I don't look white. I can't change the way that I look, obviously. But there's, growing up, you just, as a teenager especially, you think that, and you hope that you can do enough to make yourself belong. And so anyway, all that to say, I I had gotten to a point where I realized like I can't continue to exist and live like this. I at that point, right, like 13 years old, all the way through, I think I was at least like 21 maybe at the time. And just looking ahead into the future, into adulthood, just thinking like, do I want to be like drinking Slim Fast, for the rest of my life every morning? What if I become a mother? Like, is
Mhm.
that the example I want for my kids? And just thoughts like that I was like, and I need to free up bandwidth for myself emotionally, mentally, to think about other things, like to live life, because that I was not living. I was existing and moving through life. And so that
Mhm.
was when I decided to seek counseling. And I mean, thankfully there were, campus therapists, guidance counselors, and even though I only saw her for a few sessions, she helped me just to at least identify, go through the processes of identifying like um, what my what my behaviors indicate of what's actually going on internally. And she helped me to recognize that, again, a large part of my culture came from holding together all of our stresses, our burdens, our problems, and never seeking help, because if you just don't want to burden other people, right? But when we don't express our emotions, they'll come out, and they
Mm.
can either come out in healthy ways or unhealthy ways, right? And so even just something like that, like, helped me to recognize like I need to, and I can express how I'm feeling. And more so than that, I can ask for help when I need it, if I need it, right?
Yeah.
And so yeah, like that was kind of the beginning of learning to reconnect with my body, with myself. And I will say, even running that first marathon, um, it took a while before running shifted from being a tool, a mechanism, to feeling a sense of control, um, into being a source of joy and empowerment. Um, because like you said, right, like going through pregnancy and then postpartum age, and injuries, honestly, they all challenge, I think, any runner, regardless of whether or not you are dealing with disordered eating. um, those periods in a woman's life
Mm.
will shift your sense of identity and really challenge you to ask yourself where you are basing your identity, where you're drawing that from, right? And I think we see this a lot online now, but we can get so tied up in our identity as a hashtag mother runner, or
Mhm.
like a fast runner, or whatever kind of runner. And as soon as either we get injured, or we get sick, even like COVID, or we become we get pregnant, right? Like, all of these things will change how we are able to show up in the sport, and also show up physically, right? Like our space, the space our body takes up. And those are, I think, really clarifying
Mm.
opportunities for us.
Yeah, I want to thank you for sharing all of that, because you're highlighting, or I'm going to highlight something that you're sharing, where it's like it's not really a linear process, right? Like, being a runner, physically, mentally, and emotionally, it's not a linear process at all. And there's a lot of movement forward, steps back. There's so much. It's I feel like being a runner is more like dancing with the sport of running than actually doing it. Like, you're not on a path and you're straight. No, no, no. There's so much back and forth. And it's I always like to also highlight that sometimes the people that you see in the running community, they're not necessarily people that have been running their entire lives, right? Like, you're someone that's still figuring it out, and this running thing has been by your side as you've figured different stages of life out. But it is so important to take that time to understand, like, what does being a runner mean to you, and not, like you said, a fast runner, a mother runner, a run walker or whatever. Like, none of that. Like, once we take those labels away, what does your involvement in the sport mean? What does it mean to you? And I want to quote you right now, if that's okay, because you said something in one of your posts and it really, really landed with me. I absorbed the disdain I witnessed, and I sought to distance myself from other Asians.
Mm,
And again, I read that and hearing you speak now, it's like, oh, wait, here is this person that tried to distance herself and now is a cheerleader for diversity, right? Like a cheerleader for getting people to come closer to those more marginalized identities instead of distancing themselves. And the reason why, and I think I've shared this story here on the podcast before, the reason why I loved those words is because I live in Miami. If you've listened to any episodes, I live in Miami, and I am part of the dominant culture here. I am part of the dominant look here. I speak the language, I eat the food, like my family's Colombian, my husband's Cuban, like we fit the dominant culture of Miami. And even so, growing up, and I'm first generation American, growing up, I loved the Colombian culture. And it was very much like, I never went to Colombia. I actually didn't go to Colombia for the first time until I was 33 years old. And it was because my mother was terrified of taking us there because she was terrified we would get kidnapped and murdered. And, that's kind of the legacy of Colombia for me and the story I told myself. So when I went at 33 years old, I was like, I am reclaiming part of my culture here. But I did go through that phase of loving the culture. And then I think by the time I hit middle school, it was, I guess, I don't want to say it wasn't cool to identify with the culture, but it was definitely one of those of, no, I didn't want to speak Spanish because everyone around me spoke English. And I would call myself, once I got older, I would call myself una Latina arrepentida. Basically, like I am repenting, or I
mm,
am like feeling bad that I was this, and I'm trying to learn how to reconnect with that, how to reconnect with that identity. And even then, and even now, I very much so feel in between of I, and the example I give is usually it has to do with Spanish, right? Where I speak enough Spanish and I speak it well enough to not be truly American, which I don't even know what that means, but I don't speak it well enough to be truly Latina, which I don't know what that means either. So that statement was one of those where, again, like, and before we started recording, where I'm like, oh, parallel paths here, where there was that moving away and then now trying to reconnect, but reconnecting as an adult, understanding that what it means to be a Latin woman, what it means to be with Colombian heritage, it's not a monolith.
mhm,
And my experience is just that, it's my experience. It's not necessarily representative of everybody else's experience. So
mhm.
again, I share all that so that I can circle back to that question of, how did you go from disdain to simplify it, from disdain to acceptance to celebration?
Mm, mm. Yeah. Yeah. You're exactly right. I think we toe that line between generalizing our entire people group or community, while also, though, acknowledging that each one of us has such unique experiences. And there's so much nuance because you can be like you can be a child of immigrants, but then also depending on where you're living, like regionally, your experience then growing up straddling these two different cultures or multiple cultures can be very different, just based on the people around you or the environment around you, the authorities around you, all of that. And just to acknowledge that, I think already is very important and very powerful. I think that for me personally, there definitely was a connection, right, between my own journey of self-acceptance, or I should say, getting in touch with myself, my body. And that was, I think, parallel. A lot of it was parallel to me finding my own voice and turning back towards my own culture and heritage. I will say having my daughter, my first child, really brought me to a like, what's it called? I can't think of the word, but it made me have to reckon with my own issues, I guess you say, with my culture, because it can, like, none of quote unquote my issues were mine anymore, were my own anymore, because anything that was left unresolved within me was going to impact my daughter, like that's just how it is when you become a parent. And so along the same lines of thinking, when I was younger and thinking like, do I want to be on Slim Fast, right, the rest of my life? Is this the model that is this example I want to model for any future children? It was along the same lines, right? Like, if I am still in some way rejecting my own culture because I'm trying so hard to be accepted as white, what is that communicating to my daughter then, about who she is? How is she going to view herself? How is she going to learn to show up in the world, right? And that was, again, everything is still a journey and ongoing process. So I really had to kind of get to the root again for myself of like, why did I feel like I needed to reject, or like distance myself from my culture, and just needing to recognize like, oh, it's because I associate, the way that I saw people in my community and elders in my community being treated with such disdain or discrimination, growing up, like, instead of being able to, as a child on obvious, like, instead of being able to identify that the ways that they were being treated was wrong, I internalized the shame, and that's what made me want to distance myself from my own people, when really it should have been the opposite happening, right? And so even recognizing something like that was very pivotal and key to me taking the steps to check myself, whenever we encountered something that was cultural, such as, in nearby towns when there would be events celebrating Lunar New Year, instead of me being like, oh no, we don't need to go, checking myself to be like, whoa, like, why am I having that automatic response? And is it valid? No, it's not. And would it be beneficial to my family for us to make the effort to attend? Yes. So, like, walking myself through that kind of thought process, like, little by little, I felt like I was growing alongside her as my daughter was growing. And that carried over into learning to use my voice for things too. Because even early on in preschool, the preschool nurse kept mixing up my daughter with the one other Chinese girl in the school, like, not even just in her class, but in the school. And I had to address that, and also be able to, in very simplified ways, explain to my daughter why there was a mix-up and how that shouldn't happen and that that's not okay, right? Just basic, simple things like that. And learning to not shy away from these very real and necessary conversations, that we have to have. Of course, then in 2020, really needing to be very clear with both my daughter and my son that, hey, people are going to be saying things now, because that's what the leaders of our country are saying about anybody who looks like us. And I want you to know that it's not your fault. It's not our fault. But at the same time, we need to be very aware when we go out. And if anyone ever makes you feel unsafe, if you ever feel scared, you talk to us, talk to me and dad. And we are a safe space for you. Right. And just learning to equip our kids with language. I'm just realizing I've kind of gotten onto this other tangent as I'm talking about this.
No,
but
but
yeah,
it's
that's kind of
great.
the transition.
But it's great because I mean, similar but not, right? Like I got into running when well, my youngest was 6 months old, but even before that, when I was pregnant with my oldest, that was a reckoning for myself as well in terms of like, huh, how am I approaching food? How am I approaching the way I talk about myself? And for me, it was very much so I have two daughters. And as soon as I realized that first child was a girl, I said, I need to start changing this language. And even if I have the thought of criticism of how my body looks, it needs to stay in my head. I need to not verbalize that because it's not helpful to anyone, but especially not to the person that I am here to guide into personhood, womanhood, any of that. And now I'm, getting older and my body's changing again. And the languaging now, and for me, it's part of it's genetics. Part of it is just I am a petite Latin woman, which means the older I get, the curvier I'm getting. And I try really hard to exercise and stay healthy, but you know what? It's fine. So the story for me has very much so changed of like, my butt's getting bigger. How can I make it bigger? Because I just know the genetics of my family. It's going to be a big butt. And but like part of that is like changing that language and celebrating it in front of my daughters so that they can see that, okay, this transition of me and how I change and how I view myself, it's still a positive one. So it's like, I hear you. And I'm like, yeah, I totally get what you're saying because I even tell my daughters that in Miami, again, that idea of in Miami, we are the majority. People look like us. And you may not think you are a brown person, but you are. The minute you step out of Miami-Dade County, it changes. And I try to tell my girls that, again, similar but different to what you're saying, where in Miami, this is a bubble for us. This is a bubble that once we step outside of Miami, just doesn't exist anymore. And I do try to prepare my children for that of like, you're dark haired, you have darker features, they're going to look like me. They're going to look like me. So just want to say, like, I hear you and I feel that because everything we do, or at least for me, once I became a mother, I put more thought
Mhm.
into how I show up. And I have put more thought into it's like how I show up and how I am taking up space. And then again, how I am celebrating all these different things for me. And Miami, a lot of people, it's shifting, but in Miami, growing up for me, it was always like, oh, you're Cuban. And it's like, no, there's other Spanish speaking people here. Like it's not Cuban. And even with my daughters, now I have to tell them like when people try to guess where they're from, because that's a big thing here. And I don't know if that's big for you too, of where are you from? People will always assume Cuban. And I'm like, okay, but make sure you say the Colombian part too, right?
Mhm.
Because that's a whole family lineage that
Yeah. Yeah.
has made you possible. So make sure you tell people that one as
Mhm.
well. And so I thank you for sharing that, because I do feel that for many people, parenthood is a big cataclysmic thing that really shifts, because I think about this a lot of, oh, I am a model of womanhood for these girls. Just like
Mhm.
I am a model of someone in relationship
Mhm.
with other
Yep.
people for them.
Yeah.
And I am in a relationship with their father, and they are seeing that, and kind of that's how they're starting to build their worldview up until,
Yeah.
they go out on their own, and experience will teach
Mhm.
them otherwise. But I really appreciate that you shared that, because it's running, and I'll bring it back to running, where it's never really just about you.
Mhm. Yeah.
And a lot of your message in particular is that yes, I am one person, but I'm here to show you that someone who looks like me can look like you, can do all of this too. And there's power in that. I wanted to circle back to one of the questions that I had for you, because it's
Yeah.
again, you wrote about it in one of your posts, and I wanted to get your thoughts on, what are the privileges in running that people don't realize or may not think of as privileges. And the reason I wanted to ask that is, one, because you wrote about it, but then you talked about like sports growing up. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. When I was growing up, I played on a soccer team one year, but then we couldn't afford any more. And in high school, I really wanted to do color guard, which is the thing with the flag.
Yes. Mhm.
And I made the team, but we couldn't afford to do it. So like
Mm.
sports
Mm.
were a privilege. And similar, but it's like I went to the gym because I went to college and gym was included. So I would go to the gym sometimes, and I would do the treadmill, because that was the one thing that, like, I'm like, oh, that can't be hard, right? Like, you get on, you press buttons and you start. Whereas the weight room and everything else, I'm like,
Uh-huh.
I don't understand what's happening here, but the treadmill I get. So when I saw you had written something about privilege, and then hearing you speak, it's like, oh, that's another one that we don't realize. It is a privilege having the time, having the resources to be able to do these things is a privilege. But I was curious,
Yeah.
from your perspective, what are things that people just don't think about, or they don't
Mm.
recognize as a privilege, or one of my favorite words, as something that's gatekeeping and
Mm.
preventing people from entering the sport?
Mm. Oh, if we wanna get into gatekeeping, that's like a whole other a whole other conversation because that definitely is tied to, what your intro was about the whole debacle with the Tracksmith post, but we're gonna set that one aside for right now. In terms of privilege, I think oftentimes in general people think that privilege in running is simply like, oh, financial, right? Like affording a pair of new shoes every other month, essentially, or affording the gear, which is true, definitely. I think it's more systemic and broader than that, right? Like when we talk about representation, even and resource access to resources, that is a broader issue, like starting at a young age, right? And I think, and Allison Desir talks about this in her book Running While Black, right, about how even if we look back in our country's history, not even that long ago, and about who was allowed to live in what neighborhoods, in what areas, and it still hold true today, right?
Mhm.
um, you'll see that majority of people of color have been relegated into neighborhoods, subdivisions, cities, where everyone is either really crammed close together or the road system, like roadways, sidewalks are not well kept or taken care of. So that's also like tripping hazard, danger. Traffic is not control regarded, taken care of either. So that's also another risk. And then you have very poorly funded schools, or community centers. And when you don't have schools that even have decent, track and field or sports programs, how are you going to get how are you going to get students exposed, right, to these different sports, or to even participate in a sport that will be supported enough for them to enjoy, because no one wants to show up at a track meet with like scrubby scrubby gear and then be expected to compete at a high level, against well-funded schools,
Yeah.
So there's that level, I think, of privilege. And then I think, at least personally, there, in my experience, there's also the privilege of having community support, whether the community is in a broad sense or within your own family.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a pattern that comes up repeatedly in Diverse We Run stories, where it's hard being the only lonely, not just as a person of color showing up at run clubs or group runs, but being the only lonely within your family, and having to explain yourself or defend why you choose to spend time or resources to continue the sport of running, right? Like, and that's huge. That I think people who maybe grew up in families who also all ran track and field or cross country, or whose parents were, marathoners, and kind of like went along the pipeline,
Yeah.
of running, or sports, like it's hard to understand what it's like when your own parents or the elders in your life or the people in your life just really are constantly questioning why you're doing this thing that's so absurd and that's a waste of time, or that is an opportunity cost where you could be spending more time with your family, or you could be doing XYZ instead, or you're being selfish in
Yeah.
pursuing this type of extracurricular or sport, right? Like that is a different kind of privilege, and and I think unfortunately ends up keeping a lot of people, or like taking a lot of people out of the sport eventually. And I had another idea, but then now I just lost lost my train of thought.
No,
But I feel like that's a big one, the
yeah.
lack of
And
community.
I was going to say that's something that I always think of. And it was so highlighted for me in my Chicago 2021 marathon build up, where I would go for my run. And when I came home, my husband would have my smoothie ready for me, like my breakfast smoothie.
Oh,
Right. And like afterwards, I'm like, but I was like,
love.
but I love it. And it was so great. But I'm like, holy smokes, that's a privilege. Like I am
Hmm.
privileged to have married a person who understands how important this is to me and who is going ahead and making my smoothie so that I can have my breakfast before I take the kids to school. Like
Yeah.
there's like little things like that where I think we often get so caught up in the story of our lives
Mm,
that we forget to take a step back and realize, wait, not everyone has the same story. Like this same story is not playing out for others. And
mhm,
I just love that you brought all of that up because it is really hard to be the only person. And I'm similar, like for me, it's I'm the only one in my immediate family and a big chunk of my family that runs. However, all of them support my running. And I have done what I can to build a running community for myself so that even though the people in my house don't necessarily understand it, I do have people that I can turn to that do understand it. But as well, like that goes with privilege, right? Like I have a running coach, so I have the privilege of having expendable money to have
mhm,
a running coach. I have the privilege to be able to go out on Saturday for a long run and not have to rush home to go to work or rush home to be with my kids. Or I don't even have to, I can go out and do my long run and stay out for a couple of hours and not really have to check in. Like that is a
Mm-hmm.
privilege. And anytime I stop to think about it, I'm like, okay, so I'm not going to complain about running right now because there's really the roadblocks that I have to running right now are in my head and not necessarily
Mm-hmm.
something that is, to what you said, systemically preventing me from doing that, or it's just another barrier that prevents me from doing that. And those are things that, that's a big thing of this podcast is always just figuring out like okay, so what do we need to do in order to invite more people into the running community? And every time I ask that, it is a confirmation that the answer is not easy. That, yes, we can say like, and even when you were talking about communities, I started to think about, and I don't know if you've seen the research that's been coming out about trees and how in wealthier communities there's more trees, so there's
Oh
tree
yeah.
coverage,
Yep.
and
Yep.
then it's like 10 degrees cooler
Yeah.
than
Mm-hmm.
in communities that don't have as much resources where there's no trees whatsoever. So how are you going to run when you're like it's 10 degrees hotter there and just
Yep.
being
Yep.
outside? So even hearing you
Exactly.
say that, I'm like, yeah, we don't even think about that. Like those trees that you see outside, someone planted them there. And someone at some point was very intentional about making sure that there are more trees in affluent neighborhoods
Yep.
than in other neighborhoods. Those are all little things that we don't think about. Um, but now I kind of want to go back and don't have to go deep into it, but I'm always just curious about gatekeeping. And when we are talking about gatekeeping in sport, and I have so many thoughts. And again, every time I ask this question about inclusivity or I ask this question about accessibility about running, it is for me to use that word again, a reckoning of, oh, the things that I would recommend, I no longer recommend because
Mm.
it's not as easy as I once thought it was.
Mm.
So I'm curious for you, what do you think are the biggest gatekeepers within running?
Um, what do you mean by biggest gatekeepers? Are you talking about just in general, kind of like
Yeah.
barriers?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I think there is still a lot of this. Okay, the notion or the idea that a real quote unquote whatever a real runner is, right, and that serious or real runners are the ones who are truly competitive, or I guess like, how do I explain this? I think the idea that there is still just this one definition of what a serious or real runner is. And there's a lot tied into that very vague concept. But at this point, this year especially, I have talked with enough brands and seen people's posts and actions to at least recognize that there are still so many companies, so many coaches too, unfortunately, who perpetuate this idea that, sure, there's just the broad general running community of anyone and anybody can be a runner. Okay, cool. We'll give you those cookies. But if you're a serious runner, right, then you're going to be ultra competitive and you're going to be wanting to like push yourself in this very defined way to want to either like qualify for Boston or qualify for the Olympic trials marathon, and you were going to be, just like you're without people actually saying it, they're saying it, of like that very stereotypical typical historically used model of what a runner is, which is like thin, affluent, white, who has the resources to pursue these like arbitrarily defined, qualifying races. And it's really frustrating because it's hurtful. It's not encouraging more people to participate in the sport or promoting longevity when you're continuing to still categorize and differentiate between I don't know what an amateur runner versus what unless you are a professionally paid elite runner, there's no other, everyone else falls within this other category, right? But unfortunately, I think a lot of brands, a lot of, I don't know, industry leaders still very much believe that there is this other definition of a runner, and those are the people who are going to get their attention. And those are the people, and those are the people who are going to be what's it called, elevated and amplified and asked to speak, and all of that. So that's what the reality is right now.
Yeah.
And I just have to choose to remember that there is a whole contingency and community of people who are pushing back against that concept, that idea, that narrative. And hopefully we will continue to grow. And yeah, those are my thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's as I'm hearing you speak, I'm thinking back to just multiple posts that I see online, which this year I felt were incredibly heightened around uh, the Boston Marathon and then Tracksmith. And then I feel like we're going to start seeing it now that New York City announced that they're no longer going to be accepting time entries and stuff like that.
I didn't
And
see that part. I
oh
didn't see
yeah,
that
yeah, yeah.
announcement.
They just
Oh,
announced it. Uh-huh.
okay.
Uh-huh. So I have a feeling, or not I have a feeling, but it is such a common thread of if you work hard enough, you'll get there. And I'm like, what the heck does that even mean? Like,
Get where?
get where? And I'm
Right.
like, but I'm working really hard. Like,
Yeah,
this is
right.
hard work for me. I ran this morning and it was an 11-minute mile for 4 miles. And that, let me tell you, that was really freaking hard. And it's
Mhm,
not
mhm.
for a lack of working hard that I'm
Yeah.
not meeting whatever these prescriptions. And that's me personally. I would say the past few years has been I'm paying more attention to who I'm following online in terms of reminding myself that being a runner means, for me, at the most basic, is that you're committed to going out and running. Whether you're doing it fast, quote unquote, fast or slow, or you're walking, the fact that you have committed yourself to go out and do that, you are a runner. So
Yeah.
I find that when I first started on social media, it was great because everyone was just sharing. We're all so new to it. And then I would see little by little the accounts that had the biggest followings were the people that were the fastest. And I'm like,
Yeah.
but wait, what about everyone else? And like, aren't we all just doing this for a hobby? Like, aren't we all just like, don't we all have, there's a
Mhm,
privilege in that, honestly. To run is even, there is a privilege because to running means you have free time to do
mhm.
the running. And the
Yeah.
longer your distance that you're doing, that is more indicative of the free time that you have. If I'm
Mhm.
training for a marathon, that means on Saturday morning, I have 3 to 4 hours of free time
Yeah.
to run,
Yeah.
right? So that for me was this whole trajectory of Instagram was, oh, I just started running. I was so excited. And then all of a sudden I was like, wait a minute, I need to do Boston because everyone's doing
Mhm,
Boston. And all the
mhm.
accounts with the
Right.
big followers have Boston. And everyone is saying
Right.
that progress as a runner means that I get to this level of Boston.
Yes. Right.
And
Mhm.
let me tell you, I worked. really hard. And I swear one day I'm going to take a picture because I have in my journal from years
Mm,
ago. It was a
mm,
5-year plan of
mm,
how much time I needed to take off each year and
mm,
progress in order to meet that qualifying standard.
mm.
And I've told this story so many times, but I really get riled up about this. So thank you for giving me the space here. But
Yeah, yeah, girl. Go
I
ahead.
thought I thought that in order to be a runner and to really like progress and grow as a runner, that I needed to have that Boston Marathon, that I needed to have that Boston qualifying thing. And
Mhm.
thankfully for me at the time, my run coach was like, "Why do you want this?" Like it was very simple of like, "Is
Right.
this for you
Right.
or is this for someone else?" And
Yeah.
when she asked me that, I was like, "Oh, this is for someone else." And let me tell you, that sent me down a spiral of figuring out and then remembering that the reason why I started running, first of all, I started running for my daughters because I wanted to be a good example for them. But then I fell in love with it for myself because I was just curious as to what I could do. And I
Yeah.
realized, oh, chasing these numbers is chasing someone else's goal, which
Yeah.
is making running feel like a chore. So
Mm, mhm.
anytime I see now when people start saying if you work harder, or I even hear people say I just have to work harder to do that, and it's like, no, like, aren't you already working hard? I want to meet the person who goes out for a run and is like, that was the easiest thing, that was so delightful, let's do it again. Because that doesn't, I mean, I maybe have like one run like that a month where I'm like, that was a great run. Yes. Most of
Mhm.
my runs are kind of like, all right, Steph, like I have to convince myself that I can do it. So to me, that is part of this conversation of gatekeeping, of this messaging that some people send out and some brands of if you work hard, you'll
Mhm.
get this. And
Mhm.
let me tell you, this is a lesson that I'm teaching my children now of like, yeah, you know what? You can work hard and still not get it.
Yeah.
And guess what? That's
Yeah.
life.
Yep.
So
Mhm.
I find that even saying that, it makes people question whether they're even working hard. And it's like, but you
Mhm.
are,
Mhm.
like,
Yeah.
you're doing it. So I'm hoping, I'm going to put my hope in yours and I'm going to borrow some of your belief here that things are changing. Because when you tell people that being a runner means doing this race, or being a runner means working hard and doing this and doing that, we're placing running in this box
Yeah. Mhm.
that does not take into consideration how unique each and every person is.
Exactly. Yeah. Word. I'm like, "Oh, yes, all the snaps."
So that's why
Yes.
that's
Mhm.
why I appreciate, and here I'm going to bring it all back together as we start to wind this conversation down. This is why I appreciate the Diverse We Run page, because you feature different athletes, and not only are you featuring these people who are doing this thing called running, you are highlighting their stories. Like I went back and I'm like, she's not even mentioning, like in these stories, there aren't times, right? Like it's not like, oh, Boston qualifier times 5, marathon PR, 5K PR. And I want people to know there's nothing wrong with that stuff. And it's all great. But there's so much more to who you are than the numbers. And how did you make that conscious decision? I'm going to assume it's conscious. I'm giving you a lot of credit here to highlight the story and not so much the the product, I guess, of that story.
Mhm. Mhm. It's interesting because I ask every single runner. Like I have a list of questions that I send to people, and to give them kind of like a starting point, to help them, think through what they want to share. And I ask every person, what is the running accomplishment that you are the most proud of? And kid you not, like no one just states like a time. You know what I'm saying? Like no one's like, "Oh, I'm the proudest of the fact that like I qualify for Boston." You know? And it's always, people are the proudest of things they do that either involve and like benefit their community, or that's like tied to just a greater, bigger purpose beyond getting faster. And most often than not, I mean, not to say, I definitely, there have been featured runners who are Boston multiple time, like Boston qualifiers, and people who are very fast. But even with their stories, the things that they're proud of is more or less like the impact that their journey has had on raising others up, on bringing others in. And I feel like that is really just, I hope that is the heartbeat, of our running community and of the sport, that people can see more, and like that we can hold on to, moving forward. Because that's really what's going to bring about longevity in our sport. And it's truly how we can also just use running to better our community, right? And our life. So really, I have the people to thank. You know what I'm saying? Like, it just, that's one of the most remarkable and beautiful things I have witnessed in sharing these different stories, that at least, from my perspective and from the couple hundreds of athletes whom I've featured, people of color, we show up in the sport for reasons greater than ourselves. Yes, people definitely want to take care of themselves, like their own health and wellness. But there's always this underlying sense of altruism, that is like moving people forward. And because for the most part, runners, athletes of color, there's a cost, to us showing up in this sport where we are still the minority in many ways, right? There's a cost and there's a risk. But yet people choose to do so repeatedly, day after day, week after week, month after month, because for others,
Yeah.
and that's, I don't know, that's beautiful. Every time I think about that, I'm just like, yeah, like perspective.
Yeah. And it's also just even thinking of some of the ones that I read where it's like you have a lot of people who are the first in their families
Mm,
to do this. And it is them being the first. And I hope everyone realizes this, where it's like you're the one that is creating a new path forward for everyone around you.
yeah.
Whether it be that your parents see you running and then they get curious and want to do a 5K, or that you have children and then they want to think about doing that as well. So
Mhm.
it's never, and again, it's never really just about you, right? Like running may feel like a very individualized sport when you're in it because you're the one doing the
Yeah.
running, but there's always someone that is watching, and there are always people that you are inspiring without even knowing it, right? Like when you share your story, you have no clue whose heart it's going to touch, which is
Mm,
why it's so important to share those stories.
mhm.
So, all right, can you remind us what are the social media websites that we can follow you on and find out more about you?
Yeah. So of course, you can follow Diverse We Run on Instagram. That's where all the storytelling and different runners happens. And then my own personal account is I Run for the Glory, and that's also on Instagram. I do have a website, I run for the glory.com. And if anybody, I don't know, wants, there's like a inquiry section too, if you wanted to email me or reach me. But of course, you can always slide into my DMs on Insta. So that's primarily how you can reach me.
What do you have coming up that we can celebrate you in?
Oh, you had this question on your survey form, and that got me stuck for a while. I was like, I got nothing. I got no races. I have like no projects that I'm launching. But honestly, it did make me think, okay, what I can celebrate and what I am celebrating right now is the fact that, well, I just turned 40 and it's just this new, I feel like I'm entering this new era of life where I want to I want to feel more comfortable in my skin, in who I am. You know, as you were referencing earlier, there's just a lot changing in a woman's body at this stage of life, but also just, you know, I just I feel ready. I feel ready to take a bet on myself. I feel
Mm,
ready to stand in my strength, and I feel ready to act even when afraid, you know, and to step out in faith over fear in this next year. So, yeah, that's what I'm celebrating. That's what I would like to share.
I love that. I love that because that's where I find getting older as a woman, I even for myself, I feel like there's some story changing that I need to do in
Mm,
terms of, I think of like the women in my family, the older women have all gotten plastic surgery and, on their face, on their body. And I'm like, no, I again respect to people who do that.
mhm,
But for me, I'm like, I want to embrace the wrinkles. Like for
mhm,
me, my wrinkles are a sign that I have lived, that I have felt, and that I have not felt ashamed to share it on
mhm,
my face. So
mm.
I find that the older I get, I'm like, all right, let's just bring it all on. And can I laugh louder? Can I try to get myself to actually cry? Because I have trouble with crying, even though I feel it.
Oh,
Even though I
oh,
feel it, I'm like, I can't, I try. So it's like, can I just feel more deeply into everything and not feel like I have to apologize for feeling
mm,
deeply?
mhm.
So
Right.
I love all of that. Okay, final question. And thank you so much for all the time you gave us. Final question is just, do you have any final words for us?
Oh gosh. You know, like, well, this has been my mantra ever since Des Linden said it, but you know, keep showing up in whatever ways you're able to for the day, you know, in this season of life. Um, yeah, one day at a time.
One day at a time. And with that, everyone, thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time. Bye.